The next event will be a fireside chat between Ann Neuberger, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, and Ylber Bajraktari, Senior Advisor at the Special Competitive Studies Project.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you so much, Ann, for joining us. It's such an honor, such a pleasure to welcome you back at the SCSP event. You inspire, guide, and support a lot of our work, so I'm truly grateful and humbled by the opportunity to host you here.
I will say, just before you go, it's always a pleasure to come to SCSP events. The technology is fundamentally changing national security, and SCSP really brings together the people, the technology, and the mission to help us drive forward. So
thank you so much.
It's always a pleasure.
And then for those of you who may not know, Ann Neuberger is the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. Ann is the first person to hold that position, which speaks, I think, both to what Ann was saying, which is this centrality of technology to national security, and also, I think, to your exceptional skills and experience and leadership that you bring on this job. Ann had spent nearly 15 years previously at DoD and at NSA, and is one of our nation's foremost experts when it comes to cyber. So truly a pleasure to have you here. I should note also that Ann had a very successful career in the private sector and then joined the government, which is usually not the sort of the sequence in DC. So appreciate you taking this leadership on, and I obviously commend you for spending almost 4 years now at the White House, and having spent 2 tours there, I know it's a grueling job. If we could dive in, Ann, if you don't mind. So obviously you've spent a lot of time on cyber and cyber threats, particularly in terms of defending our critical infrastructure, our defenses, our grid, and other issues. As AI and robotics get increasingly integrated in our critical infrastructure, in our national defense systems, how do you think the threat landscape will change? What are some of the new vectors of attack that may emerge that our adversaries may take advantage of?
Absolutely. So I'll jump into the question at hand, but I wanted to take one moment just to follow up on your very kind introduction, which is to say that, like you and Yuli, I come from a family of immigrants, and I think we all know we feel particularly privileged to be in roles where we can serve a country like no other. So I know you knew that. That's what brings you into work every single day. That's why it's been a privilege to have the opportunity over the last 18 years. And US values, the way the US projects those values globally, and ensuring that technology, we use that as a force for good, is something that so many people in this room do. I see some folks right here at the front table who also have made that the mission of their life. So I feel honored to be here with all of you.
Thank you.
And particularly with you and Yuli today.
Thank you.
So when we look at the question you asked, which is where we see the threat developing, so the dual use natures of these technologies are really where we're focused, right? AI is a driver for our military mission. AI is a driver for our intelligence mission. The strength of the US intelligence mission is the scale of data we collect. The weakness of our intelligence mission is the ability to make sense of it quickly, whether it's for strategic intelligence, what are President Xi's intentions at a given moment in time about conflict with regard to Taiwan, to a very tactical intelligence with regard to a unit in a difficult spot on a difficult mountain range in a part of the world, right? And the ability of the intelligence community to have the information, make sense of it, and deliver it. Technology is a force multiplier. Oh, by the way, we're not the only one it's a force multiplier for. And indeed, it's an asymmetric multiplier for adversaries, whether it's countries with less capability or terrorists and other groups, or criminals for that matter. So I think we have a dual challenge ahead of us. One is government has to move faster than we're accustomed to, integrating these technologies, building risk frameworks to do it safely and responsibly. And that's a challenge for us. And on the other hand, being aware of how adversaries can do so and how it becomes an asymmetric advantage for them because they're often smaller and less capable. One of the areas we see that in, just to give a practical example, and then is in the area of drones, sensors, and electronic warfare. Right? You know, traditionally, the time from which it takes our DoD, from when we see a signal, right? We'll see a new RF signal, a plane in a particular area of the world. If that is an unidentified signal, the time it takes us to identify it and then build in the electronic warfare defenses or offensive approach can be months. We can't afford to do that anymore. We have to be able to do that in moments, and that requires new organizational efforts, right? Having units forward who can make that software adaptation. It requires collapsing the collection, analysis, and dissemination cycle, because adversaries, that is the way they're operating now, and that's what's enabled groups to use drones to such advantage, whether it's in the conflict in Ukraine or in Gaza.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. Now, as you sort of describe the threat, one of the issues that has always indicated the challenges of the cyber domain has been the large attack surface, the large surface of attack that the adversaries can exploit. So as AI and robotics and other technologies can integrate into our national defense and critical infrastructure, what are some of the safeguards you think will be important to put in place? And what's your vision really in terms of how that should proceed going forward?
Yeah. So since President Biden released his first executive order on artificial intelligence, there was one key item in there. There was a request that every critical infrastructure agency, the Department of Energy for the electricity grid, EPA for water, do an assessment of how AI is used in that sector, and do an assessment of the most promising uses of AI and how we address it. So I'll talk about two of those. It goes to your question. When we think about use of AI in water systems, so adjusting the amount of chlorine in a water system is adjustable whether it's right after a flood, whether it's at a period of a period of a pandemic. And one can see how training an AI model to determine what amount of chlorine needs to be used at a given moment in time to maintain the water hygiene in a city. We can all see the value of those models. We can certainly all see the threats. If that model is trained on bad data, if that model was trained poorly, if somebody hacks into the training data, adjusts it, or adjusts the model, right? So I think as we think about that, the risk framework to say, what's the right approach? And it is an ongoing living risk framework. It's at the beginning with how transparent are we on what data it's trained on. When it's trained, how much have we validated and tested the results live? Had a human who's an expert in that area looked at the model results and said, this seems reasonable. So we have the explainability of that model. And then decisions we make, and I think that's going to be the big policy decisions regarding where do we keep a human in the loop, and where do we say, no, the mission advantage is there for speed or remote access to ensure that that model can make that decision. And what would be an anomalous decision, right? What's the boundaries, let's say? We say this amount of chlorine is normal. If the model is proposing more or dramatically less, you escalate for a human. So in those areas of cyber physical systems, we both take the traditional approach we use for risk management, but we have to add in a new layer that says, when you're training models, what is the data, what's normal, what's anomalous, ensuring there's an explainability factor, and making some new policy decisions on where humans have to make those decisions.
Now, and as part of your job, you coordinate the actions of U.S. government departments and agencies. So I'm not going to ask you to sort of name the laggards and the pioneers, but are you generally
over a glass of wine, always.
Are you generally satisfied with where the departments and agencies are headed in terms of implementing some of the safeguards you mentioned, looking at what additional measures need to be, any particular sort of the examples of excellence that encourage you that you could share?
Agencies, you know, in different areas, there are different drivers pushing the artificial intelligence adoption forward. In some areas, you know, one area, for example, in agriculture, finding crop disease faster, adjusting irrigation based on, did it rain? Is it going to rain? Those are areas where the economics of the sector drive adoption of these models. And indeed, you know, one of the most unusual conversations I had I was at CES a year ago. The administration was rolling out the Cyber Trust Mark program, which is focused on the cybersecurity of the sensor systems that are a big part of AI, the IoT systems that are used to collect data, making them more cyber secure has been President Biden's priority, and the Cyber Trust Mark program is a way that the administration is driving that forward. So I was walking around the floor to see cool and new and interesting applications of AI, and John Deere company stopped me, the tractor company, and they said, you know, we need to talk to you about spectrum policy. I said, really? They said, yeah, we're adopting AI in farmland across the country. Well, in order to do that, we now have different data communications and digital infrastructure needs. We want to be communicating real time in terms of what data they're collecting from computer vision models, in terms of looking at the crops, in terms of weather prediction models. So there's uptake in that sector, in AI for that reason. You have uptake across the Department of Defense. Indeed, one of the reasons DoD updated their autonomous weapons guide in 2023 was to ensure that even as there's uptake, the rules are clear. We certainly have adoption in the intelligence community, for example, on generating faster summaries and analysis for analysts to then review, faster translation of a body of documents, or actually automatic AI-generated translation of a body of documents, again, to enable analysts, particularly in low-density languages, you know, local dialects where there aren't available linguists. So those are the areas that are adopting. I think in areas where AI presents really new challenges, agencies are first building risk frameworks and doing a number of pilots to test and learn. The Department of Energy has extensive pilots in that space. That's in terms of adoption. In addition, as you know, there's a lot of good work that's looking at how do large language models potentially advance adversaries' development of cyber weapons or bioweapons, and how do we use AI for defense to defend against that? So that's a whole other body of work.
Wonderful. So it's a Department of Agriculture, DoD, IC, and Energy.
They're making really good progress. I think everybody's piloting.
And you mentioned spectrum. We'll make a plug that you led the development of the National Spectrum Strategy.
With an amazing team.
Exactly. So for those who may have not seen it, you can find it, I think, on the White House website. So if I can turn over to some of our more coercive and restrictive measures, I think we saw recently executive action on the Chinese-made EVs that have the ability to connect to a respective network. So what are some of those measures that you can foresee going forward in terms of protecting not just sort of the some of our economy and manufacturing, but also critical sites that we have here, whether it's military bases or otherwise, against these types of systems that have the ability to connect?
You know, autonomous vehicles like AI and robotics introduce a new set of risks around countries and criminals causing physical disruption, right? We were always concerned about virtual digital disruption, but now think about an adversary getting control of thousands of cars and causing accidents, or a particular car driven by a high-profile person. And that, whether those cars are manufactured by a country like China or whether they're US manufactured, we need to ensure that the standards and the testing are in place. It's obviously particularly sensitive when it's models, data, and autonomous vehicles of a country with which we have a competitive relationship, like China. And that's what's driven the approach on the notice of proposed rulemaking. So I want to be clear, though, that President Biden's approach is focused on both. We need to ensure that US domestic manufactured vehicles are also safe from these threats. And we want to ensure that adversary built or countries with which we are in competition are particularly so. I note that as we look at robotics, the role of China and China's asymmetric advantage, which is their ability to build capacity quickly and then flood a given market with lower cost capabilities and lower cost products is something we've seen that playbook before. And as we look at robotics, we have a temporal advantage today that we have to be driving forward. And I know that was some of the prior talks that you've had.
Okay, wonderful. If we can maybe touch a little bit on the decision making, and so as AI gets integrated more and more, and you have sort of human-machine teaming, particularly in the national security enterprise, how do you ensure the reliability and sort of the ethics of some of these systems as they become more prevalent in our decision making?
I think there's three components to that. The first thing is to say we need to first, we need to test these AI-driven robots in real-world situations, and then we need to know it's ongoing testing. We need to have the toolkits so that there's a required risk framework throughout the life of AI-driven robots. And then finally, we need the governance with regard to who makes decisions on difficult policy decisions like what's autonomous versus what's not. And I think you've seen all three components of that built out in DoD's approach and the pieces of it coming together now at DHS and CISA on the domestic approach. What do I mean? When we look at, for example, use of robots in an area that's heavily mined, it's been heavily mined, or in a given area where, for example, you may have on the domestic side a kidnapped child, right? In an area that we're concerned about explosives, we're concerned about potentially harming the child in a rescue operation. So training robots that can adjust to the environment they're in, the combination of computer vision, and well as adjust to scenarios, and ensuring the human-machine teaming when they come to a scenario they haven't been trained for is going to be key. And a lot of that is purpose-built. Certainly, going into mine-laden field, going into an explosively jury-rigged house are areas we're already seeing use of robots for effect. And I think thinking about how we work with partners around the world on the models themselves, right? Because there's the hardware and the software aspect. And in certain cases, when I think about our intelligence cooperation with countries around the world, we started the first phase of that in sharing language models. For example, in the counterterrorism fight. For example, when there are certain words that were used to mask things, and AI models helped us determine, oh, that word, that is likely a masked word used to refer to an operation. I think the next generation of intelligence and military sharing will be on training models, because there are environments that different allies and partners have that will be useful to us in terms of learning from real-world environments.
So if I could just pick up on the models and the allied piece in particular. So there's this debate, I think, in terms of whether you leverage the models that have already been produced, most of those being American produced, or whether allies will insist on sort of having sovereign models and sovereign AI capabilities. How do you navigate that challenge so that the interoperability between allies does not suffer as a result?
I suspect it'll be the same like we see in many other fields where it's a bit of both, right? I can expect for the United States we'll want to maintain an asymmetric edge. And then for our most trusted allies, we'll share more sensitive capabilities. For example, when we think about electronic warfare capabilities, that's a pretty small group that will work together to train models on, to detect signals, to respond in that way. So I think in some ways, the way we approach traditional partnerships of who we trust, who brings something to bear, either with data or with environments that models can be tested, will be the principle we use in this space as well.
Okay, great. If you look ahead and over the next decade, what do you see as sort of one or a couple AI objectives that we should be pursuing? And then what are some of the related initiatives or investments that we should be focusing on to make sure that we get to that particular objective?
I think in the national security space, as we think about the US advantage and ensuring that policymakers have the opportunity to react most effectively with the information at hand in a given crisis or conflict, at a time when the number of geopolitical crises around the world has broadened and has deepened. There's more areas of the world where we see crisis or conflict, and there's more areas where they've been ongoing for a period of time. They're not easily resolved. Intelligence plays a key role in that. And I think one of the areas, just to deep dive on for a moment, within the intelligence community is, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to make sense of what we collect and the ability to better integrate imagery, SIGINT, what human intelligence agents, officials identify rapidly and effectively. Our community has been on a 20-year journey to do that. AI offers advantages. Multimodal models allow us to work across that in unique ways. We can train AI models on the hundreds of thousands of existing reports. Today, an analyst in the intelligence community, if they want to know everything the intelligence community knows about a given Russian GRU unit, they have to go into every type of intelligence's query tool, run that, and they'll get many reports, and then bring that together. AI offers us the opportunity to collapse that, and we must do so in order to make intelligence relevant for the breadth and depth of challenges that we face. And I think, given we all run faster if we're pursued, I think imagining the impact of that to adversaries, particularly China, which has collected huge amounts of data by its espionage programs, and now we see using AI. We see China having advantages in things like facial recognition models. That's significant as we think about the impact on military operations. And in fact, as we've talked with partners around the world, to your earlier question, notably partners in countries where there are military bases, we now have a different conversation around telecommunications and on sensors and on trusted and untrusted infrastructure, because the ability for countries like China to use their presence in digital infrastructure, to use their presence in millions of cameras around the world, and then integrate that for advances in AI on the battlefield are significant. So thinking about integrating AI into the way we work to maintain our advantage and to blunt adversaries' advantage is a key area of focus today. You see that reflected in the president's executive order, in the upcoming national security memorandum that deals with more of the national security aspects of it that was called for in the original president's executive order. And I think and I want to give a shout out to the technologists and people working on the ground across DoD and the intelligence community in the US and around the world to put models, to put AI to use robots in actual missions, putting it to use on the ground as where change is going to happen.
Okay. You mentioned partnerships and alliances, primarily sort of on the government-to-government level. I was curious if you could perhaps speak to the partnerships with the private sector. Obviously, you had a very successful career in the private sector. You came into the government. You engaged with a lot of our private sector companies. How is the nature of public-private partnership changing, particularly sort of in the age of AI and robotics?
Innovation in this sector is led by the private sector. That's a key change, right? Innovation in the past in various areas of technology was led by government, was often led by DoD. Now we see the biggest advancements happening in the private sector. We see massive scales of compute in the private sector. That's leading to, I think, a challenge to government to say, how do we take advantage of that, right? The traditional approach, as you know, in the national security community is to bring data up, is to bring models up to the classified side, is to recreate things from the ground up. I think we would be foolish as a country. We'd lose a big part of our advantage, which is the private sector. That means we're going to have to think of new approaches. We're going to have to challenge ourselves to say there's risk of doing and not doing. There's risk of doing a particular mission on the low side to take advantage of private sector compute. There's also risk of the lost year, 18 months, 2 years, of working to bring that compute and that capability into the classified environment. So better doing so and having and putting the weight on speed, given ongoing advancements, given the missions that could benefit from this, I think that is the way we need to approach this.
Okay, great. Last question, and if I may, it's more career related, as we have a lot of young people in the audience and who'll be watching the video subsequently. Often you were the last person in the room, whether it was with Secretary of the Navy, the NSA Director, Cybercom Commander, now with the President or the Secretary of Defense previously. All of them have been male so far. So I'm just curious, kind of like, what does it take, I guess, to persevere and get to that level, and how do you manage that?
I would say first and above all, I mentioned at the beginning, and you're very familiar with this personally, my father and grandparents all came to the United States as refugees, and they raised us to feel privileged to be Americans. Keeping this country safe, ensuring that the dream of America can be passed on to our children, grandchildren, is what brings me and so many people here to work every day. With that in mind, I think for women in the national security environment, it has been a journey. It's a journey to have a seat at the table. It's a journey to speak up. And it's a journey to feel confident to drive the change that every day is needed. Because every day we have challenges around the world, and we must stay a step ahead to ensure that, because I firmly believe that when American diplomacy, American military, America's economy is a force for stability and good around the world. So I think for me personally, it's been prepare and then over-prepare, try to work harder and outwork, and try to always ask myself, what is the mission goal? And frame the outcome in that mission goal language. And there are days when persisting each day feels particularly difficult, and remembering that there are many who came before you, and remembering that you're passing the torch to somebody who comes after you. And I would share a particular book that I recommend for folks in this space, which is called Geniuses at War. And it tells the story of the team that built the first machine that broke the German codes in the Second World War. It was an incredibly diverse team. Somebody who came from a mechanic who knew and understood how to make products work. An individual came to Britain as a German refugee, and they worked together, and they shortened the war and saved countless lives. So remembering that it's what you bring to the table, working hard to bring something, working hard to bring other people to the table with you from diverse backgrounds, and knowing that it's a privilege every day.
Okay, great. Well, you certainly have outworked and outperformed many in this space. So again, a great pleasure, great honor to have you here. And please join me in welcoming Ann Neuberger.
Thank you.